Mhm. I'm Joon Park. Nice to meet you all. I could find very familiar names, including my supervisor, Michael Edwards. My work is actually heavily indebted to my supervisor's guide when I was doing my PhD in UCL. And I can find also my colleague's name, Elena, as well. So I'm very happy to share my work. This is the title, The Dynamics of Land Rents in Housing Submarkets, a Marxian Perspective. Last year, I had a sabbatical, and also I got informed about the opportunity of the special issue in TSG. So I submitted my, the draft and revised it thanks to the reflecting the valuable comments from the special editors of the Yunpeng and Ernesto. And also the following draft were also revised reflecting the valuable comments of the anonymous, the reviewers. So thank you for, so actually this is quite old story, as I mentioned before. This is a theoretical part in my PhD work in 13 years ago. That's quite old story, but still, I think, still it is interesting. So the contents are quite long, but I want to introduce this one by one very briefly. Background. In here, I want to explain share the complexity of the contemporary cities, and especially housing market. But the Marxian perspective, Marxian approach has a value in understanding of this very complicated, the space, urban space. And in the second chapter, this is one of the powers of the Marxian approach. That is the production, focus on the production relation. And this paper focuses on the especially residential space housing. And in chapter 3 and 4, I try to link the formation of the housing submarkets, spatial, structural, sectoral housing submarkets with the labor reproduction process. And after this, I introduced two different strategies by the capitalist developers in housing sector. That is differentiation of the venturing capitalist and emulation strategy by the copycatting capitalist. And based on this understanding, there can be an existence of the multiple layers of the housing submarket. And I want to categorize the differential rent into two. We can think of the differential rent by location within a given, within a housing submarket. But at the same time, we can think about the different rents, different common rents between multiple housing submarkets. So that we can call it inter-differential rents. And I try to link the explanations to the concept of the rent gap and redevelopment. And I briefly touched upon the transitional feature of the differential rent type 2. And lastly, I wrapped up this paper pointing out the fundamental source of this dynamics of land rents and the implications with the 4 significant considerations in the housing sector. First one, background. We know the current contemporary city is very complicated right, with the existence of the multiple centers of employment. And we have the diverse housing types, and we have wide spectrum of the surrounding amenities. So normally we try to divide this housing sector into housing submarkets like spatial, structural, sectoral, the housing submarkets. Some scholars use the term housing submarket, and some use housing market segmentation, and some use housing market heterogeneity or the differentiation. In understanding this complicated city, we know that we cannot deny the contribution of the neoclassical approach, thanks to its simplicity and some key concepts like the bid rent or the trade-off between commuting cost and the housing expansion. But we know the limits at the same time. We know the limits of this approach. For instance, Kauko mentioned the macrostructural. It misses the macrostructural aspect in explaining the origins and historical perspectives of rents and prices. And Harvey said it's oversight of the landlord and tenant relationship. This neoclassical approach overlooks the existence of the multiple potential land rents beneath the surface, right, where the dynamic movement of the capital unfolds. So we know the Marxian land rent theory can be an alternative because it contains the fundamental source of the profit, later the land rent in space. So it keeps the fundamental power in it. So that's why I focused on, I take the perspective in understanding the dynamics of the rents. I also try to link in understanding of this structure of land rents. I try to link this to the process of the labor reproduction, labor power reproduction in housing sector, and try to take some implications from it. Firstly, let's talk about what is the product of land. If the production process is important in understanding the fundamental source of land rent, then we need to understand what is the product of the land. Before moving on to the product of land, let's talk about the land and space, right? So there is some misconception of the buildings as a product of the land, but it is not appropriate to take this as a primary source of the rents. Okay? So it is more relevant to take rent, particularly ground rent for building sites, as a form of space rent. We know the buildings is a fixed capital, and it helps to create more spaces based on land. We know the space is the place where the production process is happening, right? So let's move on to the product in residential space. If you understand the product in residential space, and there can be a proper product in the residential space can be a labor power. Okay, and the source of this land rent in residential space is from this reproduction process of labor power. Then it can open the opportunity to understand this housing sector in in more appropriate way. First one is the spatial housing submarket and the locational difference in the residence. There is differences in terms of labor power reproduction in housing sector. Marx wrote some part to do with this one. That is, he said, differential rent rises when the lessees can attain surplus profit by capitalizing on well-situated building site. Right? He emphasized the importance of the location here. And if you think about any surplus profit, which eventually transfer to the landowner as a land rent, then one of the main difference is the location difference in housing sector. And we can understand this as a main differences, one of the main differences in the labor power reproduction. And also Harvey pointed out this one, saying the savings and commuting cost in well-situated residences can be excess wages, which could be collected as urban differential rent by those who hold space. And here, based on this understanding of the differential rent and the labor power reproduction, let's think about the influence of the urban expansion on the land rent, there's the land prices. If you have a more urban population and the provision of the houses in peripheral areas, then it will lead to a urban growth and physical expansion of the city. Then means that will lead to an increase of the commuting time and cost, and the total differential rent and the general level of rents in a city will also increase by this. So any factors influencing commuting cost will influence on the aggregate rent level and land prices in a city. We know there exists a difference between workers in terms of the value of time. So we can link this to the existence of the residential division of workers by income strata. In many cities in the world, we can find the high income bracket households typically live closer to the city centers, while the lower end group, in terms of income, they tend to leave the peripheral area, where they can find more affordable the houses, compromising the value of their time in commuting. And this one can be explained by the difference between the use value and exchange value of residential spaces. It means the higher income group bracket is households, their use value of the consumption of the certain residential space is different from the use value of the lower income bracket households. But we know there is a counterexample, the patterns in many US cities, where the suburban areas mainly occupied by the middle or the upper income group, but the inner urban areas occupied by the lower income households, and some segregations by ethnicity and income. Harvey explained some factors of this segregation due to some institutional constraints to provide the in inner city for the low income group, in the newly developed suburban areas, and some institutional constraints in the inner city area. This made this contributed to this kind of segregation, and this segregation fosters more tendency of the suburban development and occupation by the middle and the upper income group, and the concentration of the lower income households in the city center. So in a way, I wrote in the paper like this way. This kind of segregation can be an effective strategy or a form of resistance by low-income households. But as Harvey and Kine pointed out, this segregation can spiral into a detrimental cycle of jobless poverty. And let's move on to the structural and the sectoral housing submarkets. When you say structural housing market, it's a housing submarkets by the like some factors like housing type, number of and size, for instance, while the sectoral difference means amenities and ethnic segregation and the educational opportunities and accessibility to the parks or something. Before this, further moving to the structural housing submarket, and let's talk about the capitalist developers, house builders approach in the built environment. We know we have a dominant type of newly constructed houses over time, depending on the profitability and the preferences of the housing consumers, right? And this trend lead to a formation of the structural housing submarkets of the similar type of houses over time. And this one, and I'm sorry. And we know for the sales of the houses, I mentioned the preferences of the consumers, but we know these preferences is sometimes, in many cases, instigated by capital. This capitalist developers, house builders, they significantly amplify the differentiation in labor power reproduction, right? They say, when you live in this type of housing, then the quality of your life or the quality of your labor power will be different from the other housing types, for instance, stimulating the internal desire for the differentiating the quality of life or the quality of the reproduction of the labor power. The structural housing submarket, division of the structural housing submarket is also, even in the same structural housing submarkets, we know some factors influence the formation of some subgroups in it. So that is the sectoral housing submarket, and it's based on the different amenities, for instance, right? So it's a concentration of some ethnicities or the educational, being in a catchment area of some good schools, for instance, can lead to the emergence of the distinct submarkets with a different level of land rent. And let's talk about the two strategies by capitalist developers. As I mentioned in the content slide, these two, differentiation strategy and emulation strategy. What the venture capitalists can take from this differentiation strategy is monopoly rent by creating the entirely unique living space, appealing to the uniqueness of the property and stimulating the taste of the financially capable individuals. If it is successful, then this capitalist developer can take appropriate monopoly rent. So, but we know if this is successful, then we know the mechanism, the competition in capitalism. Other capitalist developers would try to take this high level of the monopoly rent. Okay, then it can make this niche market into a more inclusive market for the wider range of the consumers. This this strategy can be called, named as a emulation strategy. So the other capitalists try to replicate the similar, the type of houses. Okay? And in this case, this jumping on the bandwagon strategy, in other words, emulation strategy would lead to a formation of a structural housing submarkets. Then what would happen to this monopoly rent, which was appropriated by the successful venture capitalist? Then we can think about the change of this sort of the shared monopoly rent. Can we still call this rent as a monopoly rent, or this is a kind of the combination of the other forms of rent? For the better understanding, I exampled a case in Seoul. So as you can see in the pictures in the bottom of this slide, you can find similar houses. This is the mixed land use residence, high-rise mixed-use residence. Firstly, initiated by Samsung C&T in 2002. So you can see that the density, huge density here. And the floors, in Samsung's case, it's 65 stories. This residence, very unique, the first the mixed-use residence in Seoul, was called, the brand was the brand is Tower Palace, right? You know, the palace in tower shape. The Samsung C&T struggled initially in terms of the sales of these new properties because many consumers, many people were quite unfamiliar with this new type of residence. But it gained an immense popularity later due to the Samsung's efforts and some other factors like panoramic vista and luxurious residential space like high-end hotels. Right? Then what happened? After finding the profitability of this kind of project, then the other big companies, the big named, joined in provision of this housing types like Hyundai or the Dongbu, and DL, they have different brands, but as you can see, basically the housing types are very similar. Then what will happen to this level of rent? If you have more similar, right, the similar housing units available in this structural housing submarket, then consumers can compare, right? Then we can find some differences between these the similar houses. That is, main difference is location. Okay, in terms of the structure, size, very similar. But if you have this, you know, the houses by Samsung and Hyundai and so on, then the main difference between these houses are the location. It's the location. Then this group of the multiple residents in this structural housing submarket, they collectively have a what? The shared, I wrote like this, the shared baseline level of rent, which is different from the same, different from the shared baseline level of rent in other structural housing submarkets. And they have differential rents by location within that structural housing submarket. So here, this categorization of the introduction of the intra-differential rent, intra-DR and inter-DR, can be quite useful in understanding these differences. We know each structural housing submarket, for instance, this Tower Palace or Accra Tower or the Hyperion, this. The main differences in location that would lead to different commuting cost savings. And this can be conceptualized as the conventional, the differential rent. Okay, we can call this as a intra-differential rent within this specific housing submarket. Okay, but we have a subsequent question: how to conceptualize the rent rising from the different productivities of residential space across multiple housing submarkets. This, the Tower Palace or the similar group, this group of the houses, they have different level of commonly shared baseline rents compared to those in other the structural housing submarkets. Then how can we call this different rent? Then this the inter differential rent, this term can be quite useful, right? So the distinction within a submarket, that is for the intra differential rents, and distinction between submarkets, we can call this as a inter differential rent. And I drew this diagram. I inserted this one in my similar one in the PhD thesis and developed it further. This diagram can help us in understanding of this intra-DR and inter-DRs. In the left column, I tried to explain the formation of the multiple housing groups, for instance, under the assumption of the monocentric city. We have a submarket 1 and submarket 2 and submarket 3, depending on the profitability and the individual preferences over time, right? At the time, this this form of houses were quite popular at some period of time, and this form is submarket one. And later, another form of housing type got very popular and dominant in the amongst the house builders. Then this one, this can be called this submarket two, and another one. They have these bars represent location rent in each housing submarket, structural housing submarket. Okay, but this left column, the sum of this is not enough. Why? Because we know the existence of the difference of the commonly shared land rents across different housing submarkets, structural housing submarkets. So, for instance, in submarket one, this is the level of common inter-DR, okay? And in submarket two, this one in the baseline can be conceptualized as a inter-DR here, and inter-DR for the submarket three houses in this submarket three. And if you combine this, then we can build a model of the multiple layers of the combination of intra-DRs and inter-DRs in a monocentric city. Okay. Also, we can, based on this spacing model, we can explain the change in the level of rent and type of rent. Let's take the example of the Tower Palace by Samsung C&T again. When they built this Tower Palace, and as I explained, it got very successful, and they could enjoy the very high level of the profit, and that can be taken as a monopoly rent. But as there are other competitors like the Hyundai Hyperion or the Dongbu, the DR Aqua Tower or the similar, then they would form a another type of the structural housing submarkets. And in this structural housing submarkets, the more the entrants join this market, the less this common inter-DL would be. So, so this is one tendency, and another one is the increase of the level of differential rent. As this structural housing, if you think about the expansion of the boundary of this structural housing submarket, and you have more the entrant in this market, in terms of location, there would be some houses in this same type in a more inferior location, and more. Then the relative location advantage of the houses which locates in the locates closer to the city center would increase. So it's a total. I mean, this is a totally different the combination of the land rents. Firstly, it was a monopoly rent, but now we can take this as a combination of intra-DRs and inter-DRs. Inter-DR. Yeah. Okay, and let's briefly talk about the differential rent type 2. We know differential rent type 2 is rent from the intensive investment, successive investment on the same land. Then the actual form of this rent is all different by the condition. For instance, if the investment enhances the accessibility, for instance, to the central area, then this would increase its intradia. Then this is the actual form of the differential rent type 2. If the investment engenders a new type of space with a monopoly price, then the actual form of this differential rent type 2 is monopoly rent. In the same way, if the investment is for the entrance to the structural, one of the structural housing submarket, then the actual form of this differential rent type 2 is the combination of certain level of intra differential rent and inter differential rent. So this shows again the transitional and nominal feature of the differential rent type 2. And the last two chapters, firstly, the source of the rent. The Marx mentioned like this: the profit of the actual construction is extremely slight. The main source of profit comes from raising the ground rent and from the clever selection and exploitation of the building land. So we know the building environment. We know the main source, fundamental source of the profit is land rent. Then let's think about who pays this land rent, the tenants, right? And especially in residential space, all these different type of the rents fundamentally are from ordinary tenants payment. So we know in the paper I wrote something about the part about the unequal exchange. We know the unequal exchange between capitalists and the workers, right? The source of the creation of the surplus value. And in housing sector, in residential space, we can also find the unequal exchange between the capitalist or the landowner, or the mixture of these two, and tenants. In terms of rent, the landowners or the capitalists, they take this rent, okay? But as a payer of this rent, the tenants, the use value of this rent is actually less than advertised or instigated by the house builders, capitalists, or the landowners, right? So we have this difference between use value and exchange value. In this advertisement, it kind of exaggerates the higher productivity or the greater difference in terms of the reproduction of the labor power, but it's different, right? It's not true, right? It's exaggerated. So what actually we can get from the consuming this residential space is actually less than what we actually pay. So I tried to explain this difference using the concept of the use value and exchange value. And all the strategic approach by the capitalists is to try to widen this gap. Okay? So from this we can get some implications. 4 implications. I want to wrap up this presentation with pointing out these four implications, taking the four implications. First one is about marginal commuting cost, transportation cost, right? This cost can be reduced by the further investment on the public transportation, either through the subsidies or the direct operation. And this can contribute to the fall in intra-DI. Or in some cities, the municipality make it the fares for the public transportation almost free in some cases, but this provides some implications to us. Second, polycentricity matters. We know the concentration of the employment in one big city and its impact on the land rent levels. And let's think about, from the point of view of the ordinary, the tenants, workers, let's think about the implication from this. Concentration of jobs in limited area leads to a wider hinterland of residency, means greater urban expansion and greater commuting cost, higher intra-differential rents than decentralized cities. So some say the competitiveness of cities, but from the point of view of the ordinary workers, we need to think about which one benefits us. Third one is wage gap. So if you have a broader range of wages, it's more likely to result in greater differentiation and widened inter-differential rents in structural or the sectoral housing submarkets. So this differentiation and emulation would take more share of workers' income in a form of land, I think. And fourth one is consideration of the planning regulation and public investment. We know the power of this authority in controlling land use, density allowance, and in terms of the formation of the urban space. This regulation or the engagement can set some limits for the differentiation strategy or the emulation strategy, more widely the capital investment and consequently land rent. We need to actively engage in the management of the planning gain, for instance, potential creation and the management of the planning gain from increased potential land rents by this change in regulation, and try to take the part of this planning gain for the more to the ordinary tenants and workers. Okay, this is it from my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I see a question already coming up in the chat box. I know Ernesto have a couple questions and also some general comments. Do you want to start first? Or we start
yes,
with the question?
Thank you. Thank you very much, June. It was amazing, amazingly interesting what you presented today. We decided to place your paper in the first place in the special issue because we believe your contribution should arise more reflections on the rent gap and land rent theory. This is the only. I'm gonna go really briefly to some points and then ask our colleagues to intervene because it is more interesting that other people reflect on this paper. A simple idea. This is the only. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Any in the audience, Joon, but this is the only work I've seen that takes the rent gap. If we assume that this work is debating with the rank gap theory. This is the only one that sees or has the potential to understand the rank gap theory at a metropolitan level scope. Because what we see here are so many different rank gaps intervening, interacting, and combining to create a city space. Because maybe that's the only limitation that I see in the rank gap theory. It's as it was presented by Neil Smith. It was so neighborhood constrained. It was so one case oriented. So what June's work does, in my views, is to combine and explain the enormous diversity that we see in rent levels, land rent levels, and housing prices. This is my only comment. I would say I have a few questions, but I would like other people to ask the questions and, if possible, reflect on my comments. Thank you very much.
We have a comment in the chat box from Guo Tianao. I'm not sure I pronounced the name correctly. Yeah. Do you want to unmute yourself, ask a question, or? Yeah.
Please go ahead, Tiano.
Oh yeah, I see. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Oh
we can.
yeah, yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Park. Thank you for the informative lecture, and I think your work is very, very important in the current land rent debate, because I'm working on my master's thesis and I carefully examined your theory, and I think it really helps a lot. And so I have three theoretical questions. Yeah, about your framework. Yeah. And the first is, you think residential space is already a product of land. Then it's a capitalistically produced commodity. Then how can it have another product of land? By saying this, what's the difference between your conceptualization of this kind of rent and the post-Keynesian notion of like everything is an asset and everything generates rent, what's in the financialization hypothesis. And the second question is that in Marxian tradition, the reproduction of labor power is not the same as the production process of other commodities, because workers, they consume housing as a consumer good. So what they want is the use value rather than value. And so they're not making profit by reproducing their labor power, but the goal is to make their own living. Yeah. So how can the price differentiation be a kind of excess profit for workers and make a difference of the housing rent in the urban context? And the third question is, you mentioned bid rent theory, about the opportunity cost of commuting of the workers and the individual preference of housing types, the favorable types of housing in a certain period, and they have a neoclassical basis. For me, I don't know if that's true, but how do you make them structurally coherent with the labor value theory in the Marxian tradition? Yeah, that's my three questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good questions. June, would you like to reply to Tiano? Please.
Yeah. Top questions. First question is maybe is from the kind of some mistakes in my presentation, I think. When I talked about the product of the productive land or the productive space, and especially the residential space, that is labor power, not the residential space itself. So if you look at so for instance, commercial space, we know the process of the production process. And if it's industrial space, we know the process of the production quite clearly. But what is happening in residential space, then there is a reproduction process of the labor power. So that's why I mentioned that, and that is the fundamental source of the land rent in residential space. We need a space, residential space, as the other sectors, the users need the space for the certain purpose, mainly the production, right? And this residential space, the workers need to have this space for reproduction of their daily labor power. So that's why I tried to understand the source of the rent from the residential space as a labor power reproduction process. And the second question is about the okay. I mean, this is actually from the Harvey's contribution. This is also linked to the David Harvey's contribution of the understanding of the urban differential rent connecting to the possible the excess saving or the excess profit to the workers in terms of the savings and commuting. So we know in the process of the reproduction of labor power, we need to consume, as you, Tiano mentioned, we need to, to consume the product. But what is different in residential space is the space, the location. Okay, if you extend the reproduction process to the process just before the exchange of our labor power in our workplace, for instance, then we can include the commuting, okay, in the process of the reproduction of labor power. Then we can take the difference from this consuming the houses in different locations like this way. And also you mentioned about the existence of the wage differences and how to link this to if there is the differences in the wage levels, and how can we link to this the existence of the rents in the housing market in general. So here, the concept of the bid rent is quite useful. We know that there are myriads of the different levels of the income of the workers, but in terms of the housing market, and if you apply the concept of the bid rent, and the determination of the rent in a specific housing unit, then someone who can afford to pay, a certain level of the rent can take the specific housing unit in specific location. Okay, so we can understand that is in this way. I think. And third question is really hard question to answer. Link this models to a labor value. The theory. This is actually quite a hard question. So maybe someone in this audience can help me. And maybe later I can work more on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
May I counter reply to the third question, please? If I understood well, that question asked you, how do you combine Marxian perspective with sort of continuance, locational Alonso type model of build rent curves? And I think that's precisely what makes this paper so amazing, that you so effectively manage to combine the two. Because, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that the Marxian theory on land rent does not include really substantially the distance and the commuting problem. It just says it's a matter of labor force extraction, the extraction of wages. So when we talk about planning and urban issues, we need to consider space. So this is what makes this contribution so interesting to me, to my views. Not just because of that, of course, there are other things, but this is some core issue. So maybe you like to reflect more on that. And I would like to add another question. If you see any resemblance with Schumpeter's creative destruction theory, because he said basically the same. You know, the most innovative, creative producers innovate, producing surplus profit because they add technology to the production. But then the others replicate or emulate that technology. So that's according to Schumpeter, and this is something that has been applied in cities too. But according to Schumpeter, there is a time gap between differentiation and emulation. Say, Schumpeter said normally 2 years since Steve Jobs created the personal computer, and then the rest of producers emulated that personal computer. I mean, this is a very bad example, but I wanted to give an example of this. So in the city, my question to you is, do you see any way to estimate, maybe anticipate that time of emulation? Did you measure the time since Samsung created this very tall tower and then all the rest started to replicate it? Or maybe anticipate it in a theoretical model, I don't know, but I think time is something important for planning purposes.
I thought about the time gap between the differentiation and emulation strategy, but in the case of the Seoul's, the mixed use, the high-rise residence, let me check that in the paper. Let's take this one. The year when the Samsung C&T completed the Tower Palace, that was 2002. And the following years, the Hyundai Hyperion 2003 and Dongbu Centralville 2005. So I cannot build a model to estimate this one, but it depends on the time for the in this for the investment, right, in the housing sector. It will take time, and for the competitors, the potential the copycatting, the house builders, they need to observe what is going on in the sales market of this newly launched project. Then based on this, they can decide to join this market. And for the production itself, it will take around a couple of years. Then that's very interesting question, but I think that will depend on the sales, the level of the profitability, and so on.
Yeah, we also have a question from Michael Edwards. Michael, do you want to ask a question yourself, or should I read it?
Yeah, well, I could ask it, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Yes, we can.
Good. Well, I'm really happy to see that Joon has been developing this idea that we should think about the reproduction of labour power as being the important product of production on land. And that was always, I think, going to be one of his most important contributions. And here it is, really generating a lot of interest and being very useful. My question is, does this way of thinking help us to understand how employers will behave in relation to the planning of the city and its transport? I mean, when I say employers, I mean capitalist enterprises which employ labor in the city. That's the question. I don't know if that provokes any answers yet, but for me, that's a very important question, because capitalists behave in such contradictory and difficult ways. Very hard to understand whether they're behaving like employers or behaving like landowners or speculators or what.
Yeah.
I think that was that.
Yeah. Thank you for the very insightful question. So the capitalist I mentioned, okay, we have the different the capitalist by sector, for instance. If you think about the house builders, the developers, from the point of view, providing more luxury, or compared to the existing ones, providing a sort of better ones to the consumers, and the taking more higher rent, that is important. But the capitalist in other sector, for instance, in general industrial sector, for instance, from their point of view, this increase of the house price, the land rent in housing, that is kind of the pressure for the paying the higher wages for them. So it can increase the cost from the point of view. So in the capitalist, there can be some conflict, I think. So that's why some capitalists try to move their headquarters or the factories to other city or the other area. I think we can, we can explain this with the existence of the capitalists which have a different interest, I think. But as a government, if you understand government to reflect the collective interest of the capitalist, for instance, then the approach can be very difficult, kind of the balance in terms of the general profit.
Yes.
Then, yeah.
Yes.
Michael, you can enlighten me, enlighten us.
Thank you.
We have a
Thank you very
couple
much.
minutes for a few questions. Ernesto, do you have any further questions?
I have so many, but I don't know. Do we have more questions from colleagues in the group?
I don't see much about.
Yeah. No, this is a simple question, but how do you settle, June, your theory of differentiation, emulation, and the multiple differential rents inter, with this very simple idea of Neil Smith, which I assume you know, or you have read about. So maybe you could not be really a super expert on the Renga, but you know the simple idea. You know, the capitalized ground rent very low, the potential ground rent is high. The developer or the landlord would like to maximize their earnings by doing something. I wouldn't say gentrification. I think that was too 1970s, maybe. I mean, maybe those property owners in Hong Kong are maximizing their potential ground rent by subdividing housing units into these very tiny 15 square meters units where family lives. And that's not gentrification to my views. There's something different, but it's the same exercise of maximizing the ground rent absorption. So what is your dialogue with Neil Smith's theory? I don't remember if you mentioned gentrification in your, I think you do, but it's not the main topic of your paper. So what's your reflection on the record? Basically, that's my question.
Yeah, when I was doing my PhD under the supervision of Michael Edwards, I tried to firstly understand the concept of the Marxian land rents, and the purpose of this study was to develop this traditional theory into something feasible in an urban context. So as I introduced in the first slide, the structure of the current cities, especially the mega cities, is very, very complicated, right? The existence of the multiple layers, the centers, for instance. Then we need to employ a way to divide the housing market in terms of the spatial housing submarket. And we know the existence of the different structures, different housing types and size. And that's why we used the concept of the structural housing submarket linking to the Marxian land rent theory in an urban context. In this process, we can build this kind of model of the existence of the multiple layers of land rent, of intradial and interdial. Then, in this process, we can link, the Neil Smith rent cap theory, in this model. Then this model, we find this model can have some power in understanding and the application of the rent cap theory further. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. But I see the monopoly differentiation, the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's the highest potential ground rent possible. That level is due to technology, due to the economic power of the developer.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that every other developer would like to aim to. Maybe they cannot, but a few ones can. But that's for my understanding of your paper. That's if Neil Smith read your paper now, maybe he would think about that. That capacity that developers can achieve, some certain developers.
Yes. Venturing new type of housing, new type of space for the super access profit.
Yes. And I see the intervention of the state here. It's very clear how the state could intervene. So I think policymakers and planners should read the paper because, I mean, I can imagine after reading your paper, I could imagine how a planner or a policymaker could extract some value from this game of different web creations. And this is something that states and urban government should look at in order to understand, for instance, land value capture. You know, land value capture is a measure that is very effective sometimes to extract part of the value or the profits from developers or landowners to, I don't know, afford social housing, public housing, or infrastructure, things like that. But sometimes it fails because it charges so much in certain areas, or sometimes it's ineffective because it charges so little in some other areas. So the implications of your work, I see, is that it can measure and calibrate the exact amount of value that the state might want to capture from operations. This is something that maybe people should reflect more about.
Yeah, in the last chapter, including the four implications, four considerations, and the last one is to do with the land value capture, control, and the management of the planning gain or the development gain. This is mainly created by the public sector, but taken by it, depending on the regulation, but mainly taken by the capitalists or the landowners. But what I wanted to wanted to emphasize was we can, if you understand the creation of these values from planning authority, then if you understand the source of the creation of this, the land rents from the planning authority through this regulation or the provision of the infrastructure, the public sector have a right on this management of this created land values, newly created land values based on this land rents for the wider community. Okay, that is the point I want to make in the implication chapter, and also the transportation policy. In terms of the transportation policy, that is important, and also the so-called the housing provision policies. If we have a proper understanding of this structure of land rents in a city, then provision of the houses in peripheral area, they may sound as a quite effective way to stabilize house prices or the rent, but what it increases eventually is the relative differences in the location advantages. So if you provide more houses and more houses in peripheral areas, then the location advantage in central area would increase further. And this formation of the differential rent, intra-differential rent, is kind of permanent, right? Compared to the inter-differential rent between the housing submarkets. So if you think about this impact of the expansion of the cities, then we need to be, the more careful, right? We need to be think twice of this housing provision, where to provide, and that is also important. And also in terms of the public transportation policy is very, very important in terms of the intra-differential rents.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we should wrap up now. Thank you, Joon, for such an informative talk. Lots of conceptual tools for us to think about the implications, to understand the urban processes, but also to think about planning policies, transport policies, or housing policies. So thank you very much for this talk. I know it's already quite late in Korea. It's probably close to midnight, so we don't want to keep you stay up for too long. Thank you very much. For those of you who are interested in the kind of concepts Joon introduced, you can read his paper published with TESG. It's the first article in the special issue providing the kind of conceptual debate. Next week, we have another lecture exploring the rent theory and rent gap theory in the context of Hungary. If you're interested, please follow us. So thank you all, both to the panelists and also all the attendees for joining us this afternoon. Thank you very much. We hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's really nice to meet you, Michael.
Yeah, you.
And Ernesto.